The dust of Redemption, Texas had a bitter taste. Opal had been in the town for 6 weeks, and she had yet to grow accustomed to it. It coated the back of her throat, settled in a fine red film on the warped floorboards of her cabin, and clung to the hem of the one good black dress she owned. It was the taste of being alone. Her son Leo didn't seem to mind it. At 7, the world was still a grand adventure, and the dusty street was just another place to draw lines with a stick. For Opal, it was a constant reminder of how far she was from the green hills of Ohio, from the life she'd had before the fever took her husband and left her a widow with nothing but a tired horse and a future as thin as a church wafer. Her cabin sat at the very edge of the settlement, just before the proper town gave way to the endless, thorny brush of the plains. It was small, drafty, and smelled of the lye soap she used to take in washing. The work was hard on her hands and paid little, but it kept her and Leo fed. Barely. The women of the town were polite enough when they dropped off their husbands' shirts and their children's smocks, but their eyes were cool. They saw a newcomer, a woman without a man, a charity case waiting to happen. They did not see a threat, not yet. They simply did not see her at all. She was just the widow, a shadow at the edge of their busy, prosperous lives. For the past 2 days, a frantic energy had gripped Redemption. It buzzed in the air like a trapped hornet. The daughter of Mr. Calloway, the man who owned the vast Circle C ranch that bordered the town on all sides, was missing. A little girl named Lily, no older than Leo. She had wandered from a picnic near the creek and vanished into the brush. The entire town, it seemed, was consumed by the search. Men on horseback thundered past Opal's cabin at all hours, their faces grim. Their shouts echoed in the distance, a sound of desperate, failing hope. Opal watched them from her window, her hands still in a basin of soapy water. She saw their methods. They rode in wide, noisy lines, crashing through the scrub, calling the girl's name. They were hunters, used to tracking deer or chasing down stray cattle. They were not looking for a lost child. A child doesn't run in a straight line. A child gets scared, curls up, seeks shelter in places a man on a horse would never see. She knew this in her bones, a knowledge passed down from her father, who had lived with the land, not just on it. He had taught her to read the story written in bent grass and overturned pebbles. By the afternoon of the second day, the frantic energy had curdled into a quiet, ugly despair. The riders returned to the Calloway Ranch in smaller, defeated groups. Their shoulders were slumped. Opal could feel their failure from her porch. She dried her raw hands on her apron, a decision hardening in her chest. Leo was playing near the steps, humming to himself. The thought of another child, a little girl, out there alone as the sun began to sink and the coyotes started their nightly chorus, was a pain she could not endure. It was not her place. She was a nobody here, but she could not stand by and do nothing while they all did the wrong things. She pulled her worn shawl around her shoulders, her heart pounding a nervous rhythm against her ribs. Leo, stay inside now. Lock the door behind me and don't open it for anyone. He looked up, his eyes wide and serious. He knew, as all children in this land knew, the gravity of a locked door. She walked away from the cabin, not toward the town, but toward the sprawling, imposing gate of the Circle C ranch. The dust puffed up around her worn boots with each step, a small cloud of red insignificance against the vast, indifferent landscape. She was walking into the heart of the town's fear, armed with nothing but a knowledge they would never understand. The yard of the Calloway Ranch was a scene of organized chaos. Horses stood sweating and exhausted at the hitching posts, their heads hanging low. Men gathered in clumps, speaking in low, frustrated tones. A tall man with shoulders as wide as a barn door stood apart from the others, staring out at the brushland as if he could will his daughter to appear. His face, which Opal had only ever seen from a distance in town, was a mask of stone, but the edges were cracking. His eyes were hollowed out by lack of sleep, and his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. This was Calloway, powerful, respected, and now utterly broken. His foreman, a wiry man with a mean-looking squint named Jed, saw her first. He straightened up, his expression a mixture of surprise and contempt. "This is private property, missus. We ain't got time for whatever it is you're selling." His voice was loud enough for others to hear, and several men turned to stare at the lone woman in the dusty black dress. Opal ignored him. Her focus was on the tall man whose world had shrunk to the size of his missing child. She walked directly toward Calloway, her steps even, her gaze steady. She stopped a few feet from him. He didn't seem to notice her at first, his eyes still fixed on the horizon. "Mr. Calloway," she said, her voice quiet but clear. He turned his head slowly, his eyes taking a moment to focus on her. They were the color of a stormy sky and filled with a pain so vast it felt like a physical force. "What?" The word was a piece of gravel torn from his throat. "I heard about your daughter," she said, keeping her voice soft. "I want to help." A bitter, humorless smile touched his lips. "Help?" He gestured vaguely at the dozens of experienced men and horses. "The best trackers in the county have been at this for 2 days. What can you do?" The question was not meant to be cruel. It was a simple statement of exhausted fact. The foreman, Jed, stepped forward again. "Sir, don't you worry about this. I'll see her off." Opal did not look at the foreman. She kept her eyes on Calloway's, holding his gaze. The whole world could dismiss her, but he was the only one who mattered. "Your men are looking for something that runs. A child doesn't run. She wanders. She hides. You're making too much noise. You're scaring her." She paused, letting the words sink in. "I can read the land, Mr. Calloway. I can find the story of where she went." "Read the land?" Jed scoffed openly now. "What is that? Some kind of gypsy talk?" Calloway raised a hand, silencing his foreman without looking at him. He studied Opal's face. He saw no guile, no plea for attention. He saw a strange, unnerving certainty. He was a man drowning, and she was offering a hand that looked nothing like the ones he expected. He had exhausted all the conventional methods. He had listened to every man with a reputation, and his daughter was still gone. Desperation made a man consider things he would otherwise dismiss. "Where was she last seen?" Opal asked, pressing her small advantage. He hesitated for a long moment, the silence stretching out between them. The other men watched, waiting for their boss to send the strange widow packing. Instead, he gave a short, sharp nod, a gesture of pure surrender. "The Cottonwood Grove, by the creek." He turned and walked toward a saddled horse, his movements stiff with exhaustion. "Jed, give her a horse." "Sir?" Jed asked, incredulous. "You heard me," Calloway snapped, his voice cracking with strain. He pulled a small, worn leather shoe from his saddlebag. It was tiny. He held it out to Opal. His hand trembled slightly. "She lost this. Maybe it will help." Opal took the shoe. It was still warm from his hand, and she could feel the faint imprint of a child's foot inside. She looked from the shoe back to his ravaged face. In that moment, he was not the powerful rancher whose word was law. He was just a father, terrified and clinging to a sliver of hope so thin it was transparent. "I don't need a horse," she said quietly. "A horse can't see." She turned and started walking toward the creek, the small shoe held carefully in her hand. After a moment of stunned silence, she heard the heavy, determined crunch of his boots in the dust behind her. He was following her. Alone. The Cottonwood Grove was trampled. The ground was a mess of hoof prints and the heavy boot tracks of the searchers. They had obliterated the very story they were trying to read. Opal knelt at the edge of the chaos, ignoring the evidence of the men, trying to find the whisper of the child underneath. Calloway stood behind her, a silent, looming presence. He said nothing, just watched. His stillness was more intense than all the shouting of his men. Opal closed her eyes for a second, picturing a little girl. Not running in fear, but wandering with curiosity. She let the noise of the failed search fade from her mind. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. Look for what's out of place. Not the big things, the little things. She opened her eyes and began to move slowly along the edge of the trampled area, her gaze scanning the ground, the low-hanging branches, the stones. Calloway watched her, a knot of frustration and a strange, unfamiliar hope tightening in his chest. She moved unlike anyone he had ever seen. She didn't stride. She flowed over the land, her hands sometimes brushing the tops of the weeds, her head tilted as if listening to a sound he couldn't hear. She was a puzzle. A quiet widow who did laundry for a living, now moving through his land with more authority than his own foreman. Here, she said softly. He moved to her side. She was pointing at a single small wildflower, its stem bent but not broken, pointing east, away from the creek. A man's boot would have crushed it, she explained without looking at him. A horse would have flattened it. But a child, distracted by a butterfly, might brush past it just like this. It was almost nothing. A single bent flower. But it was the first thing that felt true. She moved on, following a trail only she could see. A few yards further she stopped again, this time by a patch of soft earth near a thicket of mesquite. She was tired here, Opal said, her voice barely a murmur. She sat down. She pointed. Calloway had to squint to see it, but it was there. The faint, small impression of a child's bottom in the dirt, and the tiny scuff marks of heels digging in. He felt a jolt, a painful, visceral image of his Lily, sitting right there, alone. He swallowed hard against the lump in his throat. This woman was seeing his daughter's ghost, and it was both terrifying and miraculous. They continued on, away from the creek and deeper into the rough, rocky country that climbed toward the low hills. The sun beat down, and the air was thick with the scent of sage and hot dust. Calloway was used to this land, to its harshness. He could ride it for days, but walking it, at this slow, deliberate pace, he saw things he had never noticed before. He saw the way the lizards skittered for cover, the patterns of the cracks in the dry earth, the subtle shifts in the vegetation. He was seeing the world through her eyes, and it was a different world entirely. He found himself watching her instead of the ground. He watched the intense concentration on her face, the way her brow furrowed slightly. He watched her hands, surprisingly strong and capable, as they gently pushed aside a thorny branch or tested the stability of a rock. They were the same hands that scrubbed his ranch hand's shirts, but here they seemed to be performing a sacred, ancient ritual. A strange feeling settled in his chest, something that wasn't just desperation or fear. It was a kind of awe. As the afternoon wore on, the trail grew fainter, leading them into a landscape of gullies and sharp-edged stones. Opal found a bit of torn blue fabric snagged on a prickly pear cactus. It matched the dress Lily had been wearing. Calloway's heart leaped into his throat. She was real. The trail was real. He allowed himself a breath of hope, and it felt so foreign it almost choked him. The sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in brutal shades of orange and purple. The day's heat started to bleed away, replaced by a creeping chill. The coyotes would be hunting soon. The thought sent a fresh wave of ice through Calloway's veins. "We should stop," he said, his voice rough. "We can't track in the dark. We'll start again at first light." It was the sensible thing to do. Opal didn't even pause. "No," she said, her back to him. "We can't stop. She's been out here for 2 nights already. The cold is the enemy now, not the dark. Her determination was absolute, a sheer cliff face against which his practical logic crumbled. She was right. Another night in the cold could be fatal for a small child. He looked at her, a slender woman in a thin dress, shivering slightly as a breeze kicked up. She had been on her feet for hours, focused with an intensity that had to be exhausting. Without thinking, he shrugged out of his heavy canvas duster, the one that smelled of leather and horse and him. He stepped forward and draped it over her shoulders. "Here," he said gruffly. Opal started, pulled from her concentration. The coat was heavy and overwhelmingly warm. It enveloped her, carrying his scent, a scent of power and earth and a deep, masculine sorrow. For a moment she felt a wave of something other than grim purpose, a flush of heat that had nothing to do with the coat's warmth. She clutched it around herself, a sudden shield against more than just the cold. "Thank you," she mumbled, and quickly turned back to the trail, her face hidden from him. He watched the coat settle around her small frame, an act of protection that felt more significant than he could understand. He had started to need her, and that need was a terrifying new landscape all its own. The trail led them to the mouth of a narrow wash, almost completely hidden by an overhang of rock and a curtain of dry, tangled vines. It was a dark, uninviting place. Opal stopped, her body going still. Calloway came up beside her, the lantern he'd brought from his horse casting their long shadows against the rock face. "What is it?" he asked. "She went in there," Opal said, her voice certain, "to get out of the wind, to hide." Calloway peered into the blackness. The opening was tight, the air coming out of it cool and damp, smelling of stone and things long dead. He was a big man, used to the vast open sky. The thought of going into that tight, dark space made the muscles in his back clench. He hesitated. Opal turned to face him, her expression stark in the lantern light. Her eyes were wide and dark, reflecting the small flame. She saw the hesitation on his face, the conflict of a powerful man confronting a fear he couldn't fight with his fists or his will. She reached out and put a hand on his forearm. Her touch was firm, grounding. It was not a plea. It was a transference of strength. "I will find her," she said, her voice low and fierce. It was not a promise. It was a fact. "Wait here. Call her name. Let her hear your voice." She released his arm, the feeling of her touch lingering on his skin like a brand. She took the lantern from his unresisting hand, hitched the heavy duster up around her knees and, without a backward glance, slipped into the narrow, dark maw of the earth. Calloway was left alone in the deepening twilight, staring at the empty space where she had been. He had placed the last of his hope and the life of his daughter into the hands of a woman he had met only hours ago. He opened his mouth and called his daughter's name, his voice echoing, swallowed by the stone. Inside the wash, the world shrank to the small dancing circle of lantern light. The air was cold and still. The passage was narrow, the rock walls brushing against her shoulders, scraping at the heavy fabric of Calloway's coat. Opal moved slowly, carefully, holding the lantern high. The ground was sandy, and here, finally, was the clear trail she had been searching for. Small, stumbling footprints, heading deeper into the darkness. "Lily?" she called softly, her voice gentle, not wanting to frighten the child. "Lily, it's all right. Your papa is waiting for you." There was no answer but the faint echo of her own voice. She pushed onward, her heart a frantic bird in her chest. The passage twisted, then opened into a small cavern-like space, no bigger than her cabin's main room. She swept the lantern light across it, and there, curled in a small depression in the far wall, was a little bundle of blue fabric. Opal rushed forward, her breath catching in her throat. She knelt down. It was Lily. Her face was smudged with dirt and tears, her hair matted, but she was breathing. Her eyes fluttered open at the light, wide and dazed with fear and exhaustion. "Papa?" she whispered, her voice a tiny, cracked thing. "He's right outside," Opal said, her own voice thick with relief. She gently touched the girl's cheek. It was cold. Too cold. She worked quickly, shrugging off Calloway's heavy duster and wrapping it around the child, bundling her into its immense warmth. Lily burrowed into the familiar scent of her father, a small, shuddering sigh escaping her lips. Opal gathered her up. She was so light. "Come on, sweetheart, let's get you home." Carrying the child, Opal made her way back through the narrow passage. When she emerged from the wash, Calloway was standing exactly where she had left him, a statue carved from shadow and fear. The moment he saw the bundle in her arms, the stone mask of his face shattered. A sound tore from his throat, a sound of such profound, wrenching relief that it was almost a sob. He stumbled forward and took his daughter from her arms, pulling the child against his chest and burying his face in her hair. He held her as if he intended never to let go, his big shoulders shaking. Lily, warm and safe in the duster, wrapped her thin arms around his neck. "Papa," she murmured again and fell asleep. Opal stood back, giving them the moment. She was shivering in her thin dress, the adrenaline fading and leaving a deep, bone-weary exhaustion in its place. Calloway finally looked up, his eyes meeting hers over his daughter's head. They were no longer stormy, they were clear, and filled with a gratitude so immense it needed no words. He couldn't speak. He just looked at her, and in that look, Opal felt seen for the first time since she had arrived in Redemption. Truly seen. The return to the ranch was a blur. Calloway, carrying his daughter, set a relentless pace. Opal, struggling to keep up, followed in his wake. When they broke through the last line of trees into the ranch yard, a shout went up. Men ran from the bunkhouse and the porch, their faces transformed from despair to disbelief, then to jubilation. Calloway strode through them all, his eyes fixed on the house. He disappeared inside with Lily, leaving Opal standing alone in the middle of the suddenly chaotic yard. The men crowded around her, slapping each other on the back, relief making them loud and boisterous. A few of them looked at her with a new respect, a kind of grudging awe. "Never would have believed it," one of them muttered. A woman. But as the initial celebration faded, something else began to creep in. Jed, the foreman, stared at her, his face a thundercloud of resentment. His authority had been undermined. He, with all his experience, had failed where this quiet outsider had succeeded. Later that night, as the news spread through the town of Redemption, the whispers began. They started in the saloon, fueled by Jed's bruised pride. They were picked up by the women at the mercantile the next morning. Mrs. Gable, the town's self-appointed social arbiter and a woman who had long considered the widower Calloway a prize to be won for her own plain daughter, gave the whispers a voice of authority. "It's not natural," she declared over a bolt of calico. "What kind of respectable woman knows the wilderness like that? Like an Indian?" The word hung in the air, an accusation. And out there all night, alone with him. It's hardly proper. The town that had been briefly grateful now grew suspicious. The awe turned to distrust. Opal was no longer invisible. She was a strange and unsettling anomaly. She had stepped out of her prescribed place, and for that, she had to be pushed back down. When she went to the mercantile for flour, the conversation stopped. The women turned their backs, their shoulders a wall of cold disapproval. They had needed a miracle, and she had provided it. Now they resented her for it. The threat was not a gun or a knife. It was the slow, suffocating poison of social ruin. A few days after the rescue, Calloway's foreman appeared at her cabin door. Jed did not look at her. He thrust a small, heavy leather pouch into her hand. "From Mr. Calloway," he grunted. "For your trouble." He turned and walked away before she could say a word. Opal stood on her porch, the pouch feeling like a lead weight in her palm. She opened it. It was full of coins. More money than she had seen in a year. It was payment. A transaction. It was the gesture of a powerful man settling a debt with an employee. It was not the gesture of the man whose soul-deep gratitude she had seen in his eyes in the moonlight. The coins were cold. They told her everything she needed to know. He had heard the whispers. He was the most powerful man in the territory, but even he was not immune to the town's judgment. He had a daughter to protect, a reputation to uphold, and a strange, rootless widow did not fit into that life. The connection she had felt, the moment of being truly seen, had been an illusion, a trick of the lantern light. A wave of desolation washed over her, so profound it made her knees weak. She had been a fool to think it could be anything more. She had saved his child, and he had paid her. The account was settled. She stumbled back inside her cabin and sank onto a chair, the coins spilling from her numb fingers onto the table with a series of mocking clicks. The sound of her worth. The sound of her dismissal. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat in the dark, listening to the sound of Leo's breathing in the next room. She could not stay here. She could not endure the cold shoulders, the whispers, the daily humiliation. She could not bear to see Calloway in town, to have him nod at her with polite, distant courtesy, as if she were just another face in the crowd. The pain of it would be too much. She had survived her husband's death, the loss of her home, the long and brutal journey west. She had survived poverty and loneliness, but she was not sure she could survive this, being valued and then discarded like a worn-out tool. The next morning, she began to pack. It did not take long. She had few possessions. She folded her husband's spare shirt, wrapping it around the small tintype of his serious face. She gathered Leo's few wooden toys. She was calculating how far the money in the pouch would take them. Maybe to another town, another dusty street, another life of washing other people's clothes, another life of being invisible. It was better to be invisible than to be a pariah. As she packed, a hard, dry sob escaped her. This was her crisis, her lowest point. The fragile hope she had allowed herself to feel had been crushed, and the dust of redemption once again tasted only of bitterness and defeat. She had just finished tying her small bundle when a frantic pounding rattled her cabin door. It wasn't the polite knock of a customer. It was the sound of panic. Opal opened the door to find a young woman from town, a girl who worked at the hotel, her face pale and her eyes wide with terror. "It's my brother," the girl gasped, breathless. "He's burning up. The doctor came, but he just shook his head. He said it's the throat sickness. He said there's nothing to do." Opal's own blood ran cold. Diphtheria. The swift, suffocating killer of children. She thought of Leo. Then another woman came running, crying that her daughter was sick too. A creeping dread was moving through Redemption faster than a prairie fire. The town's only doctor, a pompous man who relied more on whiskey than on medicine, was useless in the face of a real plague. Without a second thought, Opal pushed her packed bundle under the bed. The instinct to flee was overwhelmed by a stronger one. Her father had not only taught her to read the trail, he had taught her to read the plants that grew beside it. He had been an herbalist, a man of old knowledge, and he had passed it all to her. "Boil water," she commanded the first girl, her voice sharp with authority. "As much as you can, and bring me clean rags." She ran from her cabin, not away from town, but into it. She went straight to the creek bed, her eyes scanning the banks. She knew what she was looking for. Mullein for the cough, willow bark for the fever, yarrow to fight the infection. She gathered the plants with practiced, urgent hands, her mind racing. She returned to her cabin and began crushing leaves and boiling roots, turning her small, poor home into an infirmary. The first person she treated was her own son. Leo had woken with a cough, and fear, cold and absolute, had seized her. She worked over him with fierce tenderness, forcing the bitter tea down his throat, wrapping his neck in a warm poultice. She fought for his breath as she had fought for Lily's life in the wilderness. Soon, they started coming to her. The desperate ones. The mothers the doctor had turned away. They came to the cabin of the strange widow, the outcast, because they had nowhere else to go. She worked tirelessly, moving from one sick bed to the next, her cabin filled with the sounds of coughing and crying and the sharp, clean scent of boiling herbs. She did not stop to eat or sleep. She was no longer Opal, the laundress. She was a healer, deploying a hidden strength the town had never suspected. Calloway heard about the sickness. He heard the doctor had given up. He heard people were dying. And then he heard a stranger rumor, that the widow, the woman who had found his daughter, was turning her home into a hospital. That she was fighting the sickness. That she was winning. He rode into town, his face grim. He saw the yellow flag of quarantine on 2 doors. He saw the fear in people's eyes. And he saw a small crowd of worried parents gathered outside Opal's cabin. He swung down from his horse and pushed through the door. The air inside was thick with steam and herbs. Opal was kneeling on the floor beside a child, wiping the girl's face with a cool, damp cloth. She looked up as he entered, and her face was a mask of pure exhaustion. There were dark circles under her eyes, but those eyes burned with an unyielding fire. He had been a fool. He had let the whispers of small-minded people make him retreat. He had sent her money like an insult, believing he was protecting his reputation when he should have been protecting her. Seeing her now, surrounded by the town's sick children, fighting for them when their own families had despaired, he felt a profound and burning shame. This woman was more of a force than a flash flood, more solid than the rock of the hills. He didn't say a word. He turned and left, striding to the mercantile. Mrs. Gable stood behind the counter, her face pinched with worry. Her own grandchild was sick. "I need blankets," Calloway said, his voice a low command. "And flour and bacon and coffee. Everything you have. Loaded in my wagon. It's for the widow's cabin." Mrs. Gable's mouth opened, then closed. She saw the look on his face and did not dare to argue. Calloway returned to Opal's cabin not with an apology, but with supplies. He stacked firewood by her door. He filled her water barrels. He stood guard on her porch, turning away those who were merely curious, letting in those who were desperate. He stood with her. The next day was Sunday. The sickness was at its peak. Calloway walked from Opal's cabin to the clapboard church where the healthy had gathered to pray, their fear a palpable thing. He walked down the center aisle and stood before them all. The preacher fell silent. Every eye was on him. "You have been praying for a miracle," Calloway said, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the small building. "God has sent you one, but she does not look the way you expected." He paused, letting his gaze sweep over their faces, resting for a moment on Mrs. Gable. "The woman you have been whispering about, the woman you have shunned, is at this moment saving your children. She saved my daughter when all of my men, all of our strength, had failed. Now she is saving this town. Her name is Opal." He said her name, and it sounded like a declaration. "She is under my protection. The whispers will stop. Any disrespect shown to her is a disrespect shown to me, and I will not abide it." He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The words fell with the weight of iron. He was Calloway of the Circle C. His word was law. He had drawn a line in the dust, and he had placed himself firmly on Opal's side of it. He had stood against them all for her. He turned and walked out of the church, leaving a stunned, shamed silence in his wake. He had rescued her from the town, just as surely as she had rescued his daughter from the wilderness, and him from the prison of his own grief. The rescue was mutual, and it was complete. Weeks passed. The sickness broke, leaving behind a handful of new graves and a town profoundly changed. The fear receded, replaced by a quiet, humbled gratitude. Mrs. Gable's authority was shattered. Her own grandchild had been saved by one of Opal's poultices. The whispers stopped. When Opal walked through town now, people met her eyes. They nodded. Some even smiled. She was no longer the outcast. She was the woman who had saved them. Calloway came to her cabin one evening, after the last of the sick had returned to their homes. He did not knock. He just stood on the porch until she came out. The sun was setting, casting long, peaceful shadows. "My foreman, Jed," he said, his voice low. "I let him go. It was an offering, a piece of justice." "That wasn't necessary," Opal said softly. "It was," he replied. He looked at her, at the weariness that still clung to her, but also at the unshakable strength that was the core of her. "The ranch. It's no place for Lily to grow up without a woman's influence. And Leo. He should have room to run, more than a dusty street." It was not a flowery proposal. It was a statement of fact, a practical solution to a shared problem. But it was everything. And so, Opal and Leo moved to the Circle C. Her few possessions were loaded into the same wagon Calloway had filled with supplies. The sprawling ranch house, which had been a place of silent, orderly grief, slowly began to fill with life again. The sound of children's laughter, Lily's and Leo's together, echoed in the halls. The kitchen began to smell of baking bread alongside the familiar scent of coffee. The final image of the settling was on the wide porch of the main house, weeks later. The brutal heat of summer had softened into the golden warmth of early autumn. The sky was a vast clear blue, and the prairie grasses had turned the color of honey. Lily and Leo were chasing grasshoppers near the corral, their shouts of glee carrying on the gentle breeze. Opal sat in a rocking chair, a mending basket in her lap, though she was not sewing. She was just watching, a feeling of peace settling into her bones. It was a feeling she had thought she would never know again. The screen door creaked open, and Calloway came out. He sat in the chair beside her, not speaking for a long time. They just sat together, watching the children, watching the sun dip lower. The silence between them was no longer fraught with unspoken things. It was comfortable, easy, a shared space. He had healed. The cold wall he had built around his heart had been dismantled, stone by stone, by her quiet competence and unshakable decency. Opal noticed something new by the kitchen door. It was a small set of shelves, neatly made from sanded pine, mounted on the wall at waist height. They were empty. She looked at him, a question in her eyes. "For your herbs," he said, his voice a low rumble, "so you don't have to keep them in boxes." He had built it for her. He hadn't asked. He had just seen the need and met it. It was a gesture more intimate than a kiss, more binding than a vow. It was a shelf that said, "You belong here. This is your home." He reached over and took her hand. His was large, calloused from years of work and worry, enveloping hers. Her hand, though smaller, was just as strong, stained with herbs and marked by honest labor. They fit together perfectly. They sat there, hands clasped, as the sun finally sank below the horizon, painting the edges of the world in soft shades of rose and gold. The frontier was still wild, the land still hard, but here, on this porch, in this shared silence, they had both found their way home.